For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. Sunday, November 8th, 1987. It's the midway point of the season, and we've got a battle on our hands over at the Pontiac Silverdome between the Dallas Cowboys and the Detroit Lions. For the Lions, their season is dead in the water, as this is yet another abysmal campaign for Detroit. The Lions find themselves at 1-6, having lost 3 straight games, with their most recent game being an embarrassing 34-0 shutout loss at the hands of the Denver Broncos. It's a story for another time, but basically, the Lions were coming off of one of the worst weeks in NFL history, where every day there was a new story breaking out about them in a negative light, and everything that could possibly go wrong was going wrong. Their season was over barring a miracle, as they had the second worst offense in the NFC, having scored just 119 points, or 17 points per game, and having one of the bottom 3 offenses in football. They had the second worst defense in the NFC, having allowed 213 points, or well over 30 points per game, boasting one of the 3 worst defenses in football. And their point differential of -94 was abysmal, being one of the bottom 3 point differentials in all of football. This was a bad Lions team just looking for any signs of life whatsoever. And their opponent was the Dallas Cowboys, who were definitely expected to win this game. No, 1987 had not exactly gone according to plan for the Cowboys thus far, as after a 3-1 start, they found themselves at 4-3, having dropped 2 of their last 3, including a game on Monday Night Football to Washington in one of the biggest regular season upsets in NFL history, where they lost to a bunch of replacement players and guys who were literally signed off of the street, never to play in the NFL ever again. Still, the Cowboys did find themselves above 500 and in a position, if the season ended today, to get a wildcard spot and make it back to the playoffs for the second time in the last 3 years. In many ways, though, against a reeling Detroit team, this felt like a must-win, and a game that they had to have if they wanted to turn the tide and make a playoff push for 1987. To the surprise of a lot of people, however, the Lions won. The Detroit Lions upset America's team to win just their second game of the season, and their first with their regular players all season, and their first with their regular players since November 23rd of 1986. So they snapped an 8-game losing streak in that regard, as the Lions won the game 27-17. The Cowboys turned it over 5 times. Starting quarterback Danny White pulled a Fetty Wap, and not in a good way, going 17 for 38. Combine that with no touchdown passes, 4 interceptions, and a passer rating of 20.9, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play, and it's not hard to see why Dallas didn't walk away from this one as the winners. The Cowboys played a ridiculously sloppy game, not just in the turnover department, but in the penalty department, constantly extending drives by committing 11 penalties, or double what the Lions had. And the Lions never trailed at any point during the contest, jumping out to a 10-0 lead early on, and not looking back. It was the first real sign of life for the Lions all season, and a bad sign of things to come for the Cowboys as they were about to head into the end of the 1980s. But perhaps the most fascinating part about this game, more than 3.5 decades later, isn't the final result of the game, even though this game definitely signaled what was to come for the Cowboys in the final days of the Tom Landry era. Yes, the Lions won the game, but in the grand scheme of things, the game meant nothing. The game was blacked out in Detroit, the Lions ended the strike-shortened season with a 4-11 record, and the Cowboys ended with a 7-8 record. So even if the results were flipped, nothing would have changed from a playoff standpoint, since even if the Cowboys won and finished 8-7, they would have missed out on the number 5 seed due to losing that overtime thriller on Thanksgiving to the Minnesota Vikings, as the Vikings owned the head-to-head tiebreaker. Plus, it's not like this game meant anything in terms of that day in particular. That same day, you had a 28-3 comeback in the game between the St. Louis Cardinals and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the very first ESPN Sunday Night Football game between the New England Patriots and the New York Giants. So even if you were just focusing on one day in particular, this game would not sniff the radar. Rather, the most fascinating part about this game is the fact that it wasn't played at 1 o'clock Eastern, but rather was played at 4 o'clock Eastern. Pro Football Reference is an amazing resource where you can uncover just about anything and everything on the history of the game. You want to find a box score from a random game in 1929? You want to find out what players were born on this day? You want to compare one player's stats to another? You can do it. But even they got this wrong, because their own box score says that the game started at 1 o'clock Eastern, not 4 o'clock Eastern. And in a normal world, they'd be right. In a normal world, they would be 100% right, because this game was supposed to kick off at 1 o'clock Eastern or 12 o'clock Central. However, it did not. Instead, it kicked off 3 hours later. Why was that the case? Well, it was because of some absolutely insane screw-up on the part of the NFL that has to be seen to be believed, because this was a case of the NFL not having even the slightest bit of foresight, and not even looking the slightest bit ahead at a problem that was very avoidable from the onset. Because this is the story behind the 1987 battle between the Dallas Cowboys and the Detroit Lions, the time change of the game, and what might just be, considering the circumstances, one of the craziest scheduling screw-ups in NFL history. Before I talk about why exactly this game right here, the Cowboys-Lions game, got moved from 1 o'clock Eastern to 4 o'clock Eastern at the very last minute due to the NFL's incompetence, and what exactly went down, we need some context to understand the landscape of the NFL from a variety of different angles, because it all plays a part in this story and shows the number of levels that the NFL completely screwed up on. Because to start, we need to talk about the television rules in place for the NFL back in 1987. Today, the rules are super easy to understand. One network gets to televise 2 games, and the other network gets to televise 1 game. Barring some bizarre exceptions, no matter where you are in the country, on any given Sunday afternoon, you are guaranteed to get 3 Sunday afternoon games. They could be 1 in the 1 o'clock early slate, and 2 in the 4 o'clock late slate, or oftentimes 2 in the 1 o'clock early slate and 1 in the 4 o'clock late slate. But either way, you have your choice of 3 games every Sunday on over-the-air television if you choose not to pay for Sunday ticket or use any streams. And one of those games was always your local team. If you're within a 75-mile radius of an NFL team, you are guaranteed to get that team, regardless of how well that team is doing, where they're playing, or how many tickets that team has sold. In 1987, though, that was not the case. Because in 1987, there were 2 issues at play that are not really a thing today. Number 1, games could get blacked out if not enough tickets were sold. As a hypothetical example, if the Denver Broncos are playing a game at home, and the stadium holds 70,000 people, and only 60,000 tickets are sold for the game 72 hours before kickoff time, the game cannot be shown in Denver or anywhere else within that 75-mile radius. This means that while you'll still get to watch games that Sunday on television, one of them cannot be the Broncos game. Now, if you were outside that 75-mile radius, you could absolutely watch the game without any issue whatsoever. In fact, this was a surprisingly common occurrence, where games were shown in the majority of the country except the city where the game was actually held. Heck, this even happened occasionally in the playoffs, where literally the entire country would get the game, minus 1 city and its surrounding territories. But inside that radius, you were straight out of luck. It was a way to incentivize people to buy tickets to the game, because teams got their revenue through ticket sales and concessions, and there was a fear that if blackout rules like these were not in place, that because football is such a great television sport, to the point where it's almost made for TV, no one would show up to the games. And number 2, if your team was playing at home, you wouldn't get to watch 3 games in your local market. Instead, you'd only get to watch 2, In other words, you would not get the doubleheader. Since NFL rules mandated that football must be shown continuously from 1 o'clock Eastern through 7 o'clock Eastern, this meant that you would get one game on one network and the other game on the other network, which meant back in 1987 that you'd get one game on NBC and the other on CBS. This was also done as a way to incentivize people to go to the games. There was a genuine concern that if this rule was not in place, that people would just stay home so they could have the option of flipping off of one game to the other if it was a blowout. Now, if your team was on the road or wasn't playing that day, or you lived in a market outside the 75-mile radius of an NFL team, you always got 3 games. You always got a doubleheader with one network and a single header with the other. So if you lived in Atlanta and the Falcons were on the road, you'd get 3 games that Sunday, with one of them being the Falcons game. But if the Falcons were at home and you were in Atlanta, you only got 2 games. And this meant that living in a market with multiple NFL teams absolutely stunk. Seriously, if you were a fan back then of a team that happened to play in the same city as another team, you were often straight out of luck. Because oftentimes, while your team was on the road, the other team was at home. You're a Jets fan living in New York, and you're excited that the Jets are on the road because it means you get to watch 3 games potentially? Too bad. The Giants are at home, and they share the same market, so you're only getting 2 games. Tough luck. This often meant that in these 2 market cities, one team would be playing on the road in one time slot, and the other team would be playing at home in the other time slot. And this was a problem in Los Angeles because of this team right here, the Los Angeles Raiders. There were 2 markets back in 1987 that had 2 teams. One of them was New York, which had the Jets and the Giants. And the other one was Los Angeles, which had the Raiders and the Rams. On November 8th, 1987, so in Week 9, the Raiders were playing on the road at 1 o'clock Eastern, so 10 o'clock local time, against the Minnesota Vikings. They were playing in this game right here. Now, the game itself was a rather uneventful affair. The Vikings, as you can tell from these highlights, ended up winning it by a final score of 31-20, as the Raiders dropped to 3-5 in a game that was not all that competitive. The Raiders turned it over 5 times, losing the turnover battle by 4. The Raiders trailed 31-13 late in the 4th quarter before a garbage time touchdown made the score somewhat more respectable, and quarterback Rusty Hilger made the final start of his career with the Raiders, in a game where he went 8 for 19, completing just 42% of his passes for 105 yards, no touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and a passer rating of 20.6, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. As a side note, I talked about Hilger, and not just because of how bad of a quarterback he was, but because of how stupid he was at times in a previous video of mine. So if you want to check that out, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, the point is that this game right here was taking place at 1 o'clock Eastern on NBC in the early window. Because the Raiders were the road team, that game had to be shown in Los Angeles no matter what due to NFL rules. And because the Raiders were an AFC team, and NBC had the rights to televise every Sunday afternoon game involving an AFC road team, the game was played on NBC. This meant that Los Angeles, by default, had to show a game at 4 o'clock Eastern on CBS. There was no such thing as cross-flexing back then like there is today. Today, you can have AFC teams playing on Fox and NFC teams playing on CBS and not think twice about it. I did a video on the very first cross-flex back in 2011, so if you want to learn more about that and the evolution of the cross-flex, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. So because we established that Los Angeles had to show a 4 o'clock Eastern game on CBS, thanks in part to this Raiders-Vikings game right here throwing a wrench in the plan, and we know that CBS had the rights to the NFC package of games, and we know that the road team's conference affiliation is what determines the network, that Los Angeles had to show a game involving an NFC team playing on the road. And with that, we're going to take a look at the 3 games scheduled for that later window at 4 o'clock Eastern to see what Los Angeles had to work with. Option 1 was this game right here, a battle between the San Francisco 49ers and the Houston Oilers over at Candlestick Park. A good interconference matchup. This is a really good game on paper. You've got the San Francisco 49ers, who are sitting pretty atop the NFC West with a 6-1 record thanks to a high-flying offense that ranks number 1 in football, having scored 199 points or over 28 points per game. And you've got two of the most fun players in football to watch right now in quarterback Joe Montana and wide receiver Jerry Rice, two MVP candidates. And you've got the Houston Oilers, who are sitting pretty atop the AFC Central with a 5-2 record, also boasting a great offense, with the Oilers having the 6th best offense in football at the time. Houston's last 2 games were shootouts, defeating the Falcons 37-33 and the Bengals 31-29, with the Bengals game coming after trailing by 3 possessions in the fourth quarter, and the Falcons game being won on a late touchdown by Curtis Duncan with little time left in the game. The Oilers played some absolute barn burners and were maybe the most fun team in football to watch from a game entertainment standpoint as of late. It was almost like watching the Cardiac Cards back in the 70s. So combine that with a battle against the 49ers, and you've got yourself a great game on paper for the country to see. The game didn't quite work out that way, as the 49ers were in control of the contest for most of it, with San Francisco winning the game by a final score of 27-20, and leading 27-13 in the fourth before a late touchdown by Houston. It just wasn't a great day at the office for Houston's normally good offense, which turned it over 4 times, only held onto the ball for 23 out of 60 minutes, only had 48 rushing yards on 2.5 yards per carry, and had a bad outing from star quarterback Warren Moon, who threw 3 interceptions and completed less than 50% of his passes. But for the purposes of the story, the road team was the Houston Oilers, as in an AFC team. As we established, when the road team is an AFC team, the game always has to be shown on NBC. So that game, despite being a solid battle on paper, can be tossed out the window for CBS to show, as NBC had the exclusive rights to broadcast it. Option 2 was this game right here, a battle between the Miami Dolphins and the Cincinnati Bengals over at Riverfront Stadium. Admittedly, this is probably not the best game in the world to show, as both the Dolphins and Bengals enter this one below 500, with the Bengals having lost 3 straight games to find themselves at 2-5, and the Dolphins entering this one having lost 2 of their last 3, including 2 overtime losses, to find themselves at 3-4. Still, despite the disappointing seasons for both of these teams that were expected to do great things in 1987, this game has a ton of meaning. The top team in the AFC East was sitting at 4-3, so the Dolphins were only 1 out of the division, meaning that if they won this game, they could conceivably be in a tie for first place by the end of the day. And the Bengals, despite being 2-5, were right in the thick of things for the wild card, seeing as the second wild card spot in the AFC was held at the moment by the Denver Broncos, who had 4 wins. The Bengals had to win this game to keep their season alive, but if they did, they were right back in it for a shot at the playoffs for the first time since 1982. And what we got was a close contest, with the Dolphins eventually pulling it out by going on the road and winning the game 20-14. Miami had a 10-point lead entering the fourth quarter, and despite a late effort by Cincinnati to retake the lead after giving up 17 straight, it was too little, too late. The Bengals could not get out of their own way in this game, turning it over twice, while Boomer Esiason, the normally good quarterback, completed less than 50% of his passes, while Dan Marino had an extremely efficient day at the office, completing 26 passes for 262 yards and not turning it over once. However, for the purposes of the story, the road team was the Miami Dolphins, as in an AFC team. As we established, when the road team is an AFC team, the game always has to be shown on NBC. So that game, despite being a solid battle on paper, can be tossed out the window for CBS to show, as NBC had the exclusive rights to broadcast it. Option 3 was this game right here, a battle between the New Orleans Saints and the Los Angeles Rams in an NFC West rivalry over at Anaheim Stadium. Alright, finally, we've got an NFC road team. Granted, this was the only game that CBS had the option of showing, so it was super slim pickings. But at least it was something. And it was a pretty important game in the playoff picture, especially for the New Orleans Saints, who found themselves at 4-3 as we were hitting the halfway point of the season. Back in 1987, 5 teams in each conference made it to the playoffs, so 3 division champions and 2 wildcards. And the Saints were tied with the Dallas Cowboys and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at 4-3 for the wildcard. For a Saints team that had never even so much as had a winning record in franchise history, let alone made the playoffs, this game was monumental, as not only could they keep pace in the wildcard hunt, but they could stay right on the toes of the San Francisco 49ers at 6-1 for the NFC West crown. So with all of that in mind, Los Angeles was going to get this Rams Saints game for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Rams were the local team, and as we all know, the local affiliate must show the local team on television. And number 2, it was the only game on at the 4 o'clock window, and we already knew that they couldn't show a game at the 1 o'clock window due to the Raiders playing at the same time, and the fact that Los Angeles was only allowed to air 2 games that day as it was because of the rules. And in a normal world, this would not be an issue. In a normal world, there's nothing wrong with this being the only CBS game in the late window. It's happened many times before. When you look at the schedule for games, there are many times where you see one lone wolf game at 4:05 Eastern, and the network in question has the single header and only has 1 game on in that time slot. And it's not a big deal in the slightest bit. In a normal world, on this Sunday, the Raiders-Vikings game is shown at 1 o'clock Eastern, and this game right here, the Rams-Saints game, is shown at 4 o'clock Eastern. However, remember those pesky little blackout rules that require a home team to sell out its games in order to be shown on local television, thereby incentivizing fans to come to the stadium and pay for tickets? Well, take a wild guess as to what happened here. There are many reasons why fans might not want to come to a football game. I mean, think of all the reasons that you don't want to go to a football game. It's a fair amount of money, and it's a hefty time commitment. You only have so much time on the weekend as it is to relax and unwind and get ready for the next work week so you can do it all over again. So to potentially have to get up early to beat the traffic to the stadium, then spend your hard-earned money on a game for an outcome that you might not even like, then miss all the other action happening around the league, especially back in 1987, when you didn't have cell phones or anything updating you on the scores up to the minute, when you can just watch football from the comfort of your couch and not have to pay for anything instead? Yeah, it can be a lot. And basically, this is a long way of saying that literally every single reason that you can think of as to why Rams fans might not have wanted to show up to this 1987 game right here that you've been watching, it applied in a big-time way. There's 3 major factors in particular that we need to talk about. Number 1, you have this little thing right here called the strike. I'm not going to dive too much into the weeds of the strike, partly because there are many great resources out there and documentaries out there about how unique the 1987 strike was, and that's not the purpose of this video. But 2 weeks into the 1987 season, the players struck because they wanted, among other things, better pension benefits and the ability to become free agents, since the modern system of free agency as we knew it did not exist. It's not like this was completely unforeseeable. There was talk for months on end that the players were going to strike in 1987. Prior to Super Bowl 21, Commissioner Pete Rozelle addressed it himself, and CBS Sports broadcaster Brett Musburger talked about it, saying, "A players' strike in 1987 would be incredibly damaging to the NFL. It took the NFL 4 years to get over the unbelievable damage the players' strike of 1982 did." In other words, the strike was not completely out of the blue. We knew well in advance at the moment we hit 1987 that a strike was a legitimate possibility in the wake of no new collective bargaining agreement. And this wasn't even the first time in the decade that the players went on strike, as there was tons of ill will toward the players and the league for what happened in 1982, 5 years prior, when the players went on strike and forced 2 months to get canceled, reducing the season from 16 games to 9 games, making it the shortest season, by far, since World War II, in terms of games played per team. So for the players to go on strike again in 1987, in an entirely foreseeable move, canceling a game and forcing 3 games to be played with replacement players in a product that did not even remotely resemble NFL quality football, and for the strike to be for absolutely nothing, seeing as the players were not even the slightest bit unified, and the players got none of their demands? Oh man, there was a ton of ill will from the fans. This statement from Hall of Fame pitcher Jim Palmer of the Baltimore Orioles illustrated the predominant belief that fans had toward the NFL and the players back in 1987. As he said, they care about themselves first, and they care about the fans second. So they don't really care about the fans. And I bring this up, even though the strike was over by the time this game was played, to illustrate that once you strike and lose the fans, it's tough to bring them back. We saw that in 1982. During the 1981 season, an average of 60,745 fans attended games, which was the highest average attendance in NFL history. In 1982, there was a noticeable difference with fan support, with the average attendance dropping to 58,472. It's obvious. When you cancel parts of the season, and when you have players striking over wages, in a society where many people do not even sniff the wages that the players make, people are going to be upset and less likely to spend their money to watch you play. In 1986, the average attendance was 60,635, as in the second highest average attendance in league history behind 1981. In 1987, yes, the replacement games got no one, did not sell out, and sometimes drew in the 4 figures, resembling COVID attendances from the 2020 season. But even when the players came back, the attendance was down a whopping 8,000 fans per game on average. So if it was tough to sell tickets as it was, you can bet that in 1987, it was even tougher, especially after the strike. And this was especially true for a team like this team right here, the Los Angeles Rams, because this takes me to point number 2. It's a lot easier to sell tickets when you're winning games, which makes sense. When you've got a good team, your fans want to watch you play, and are way more inclined to show up. And in 1987, the Rams were not a good team. Not even close. In fact, by this point in the season, as you're able to tell, they were one of the worst teams in football. Through the first 7 games of the season, the Rams were sitting dead last in the entire NFC with a 1-6 record. I truly mean it, that they were dead last in the conference, seeing as their one win, unlike the other teams in the conference at 1-6, was against the Pittsburgh Steelers, an AFC team, so they had yet to win a game in conference. The one win that the Rams had was during a strike game. Dating back to the end of the 1986 season, when you factor in just the regular players, including the playoffs, the Rams had lost 7 straight games, and were not a fun team to watch in the slightest bit. In their most recent game before the upcoming matchup against the Saints, they lost 31-10 to the San Francisco 49ers, losing by 21 points in a game that wasn't even that close, seeing as the Rams trailed 31-3 before a garbage time touchdown late in the 4th quarter. And the week before that, they lost badly on national television on Monday Night Football, losing 30-17 to the Cleveland Browns in a game where they trailed 30-7 at one point in the second half. Basically, in their 2 games after the strike, they were showing no signs of being a good football team, having been outscored 61-27 and having trailed by 3 possessions in both games during the second half. The Rams had the worst record in football. The Rams had one of the worst offenses in football, having scored just 120 points through 7 games, for an average of 17 points per game. This was the third worst total in the NFC, and was just 3 points off the Kansas City Chiefs at 117 points for the worst offense in the entire league. It was that bad. And their point differential of minus 64 was, to the shock of no one, abysmal. It was the fourth worst in football. When you're 1-6, your season is dead in the water barring a complete miracle. I suppose it's not impossible to come back from 1-6. Heck, we saw the Cincinnati Bengals do it in 1970, and that was in a 14-game season, where they went from 1-6 to the playoffs, but it was basically over. The Rams were 3 back of a playoff spot, and needed to run the table and hope for an absolute miracle if they wanted to salvage their season. A miracle that, quite frankly, there was no evidence of happening anytime soon. So when you've got a strike that soured the relationship between the team and the fans, and you've got a team that's playing incredibly poorly and has nothing to play for if we're looking at this realistically, it's already going to be a struggle to sell tickets. And if you couldn't make matters worse, the team that you're watching that's woefully inept at playing football, they played in one of the worst markets for professional football out there. This is not a market like Green Bay or Denver, where you can always bet on the fact that the game will sell out. This was Anaheim, which was struggling to sell tickets and support the team as it was. In 1986, the Los Angeles Rams played 8 games in Anaheim Stadium. 5 of those games got blacked out. More than half of their games were unable to be shown on local television for failure to sell seats. Keep in mind, 1986, as we already established, was a banner year for the NFL in terms of attendance. Second highest attendance of all time. And the Rams were a good team. The Rams went 10-6 that year. They started the season 7-2 and 10-4. They made it to the playoffs. And yet, despite that, they couldn't sell out the games. In 1985, the Rams won the NFC West with an 11-5 record, and made it all the way to the NFC Championship, coming within 1 game of the Super Bowl. You would think that they would be the hottest ticket in town, right? Well, of the 8 home games that the Rams had in 1985, 6 of them were blacked out and were not shown on television. The only 2 exceptions to this rule were a game against the San Francisco 49ers, where you had a ton of visiting fans due to the Niners being a great team and a nearby team with a large fan base, and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about if you've watched, quite literally, any Rams game against the 49ers in Los Angeles since the Rams moved back to LA roughly 1 decade ago, and a game against the Los Angeles Raiders, where you had a ton of visiting fans due to the Raiders also being located in Los Angeles. Against non-California teams, in 1985, the Rams had all 6 of their games blacked out. In 1984, you saw the same thing, even though the Rams were once again a really good team that went 10-6 and made it to the playoffs. The Rams played 8 home games in 1984, and of those 8 games, 6 of them were blacked out for failure to sell out. And it's even worse than that, because on December 23rd, they hosted the New York Giants in a playoff game, hosting them in the wild card round. And yet, despite the fact that it was a freaking playoff game, the game did not sell out, meaning that it was blacked out locally in Los Angeles. Over the past 3 seasons, the Rams were a very good football team, posting double-digit wins every single season and posting a combined record of 31-17 for a winning percentage near 65%. Most teams in the NFL would die to have that level of success. And yet, of the 24 home games they played in that stretch in the regular season when they were good, 17 of them were blacked out. Take out the games against the California teams, so the Raiders and the 49ers, and of the 20 home games that the Rams played in that stretch, a whopping 85% of them were blacked out. It was a near guarantee that if the Rams were playing a game as it was, then it would not sell out. It was as sure of a thing as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. And again, that was when they were good. And this isn't even including 1983, when they made it to the playoffs with a 9-7 record and made it to the divisional round and had 7 of their 8 home games blacked out. Now, at this point in 1987, they were the worst team in football, at 1-6, and were doing this in a season where tensions amongst fans were at an all-time high following the second strike and cancellation of some games in the last half-decade. When you combine all of these elements, it's no real surprise that this game that you're watching right now, the battle in question between the Los Angeles Rams and the New Orleans Saints, was going to be as easy as pulling teeth from a ticket-selling perspective. I mean, you could try. You could absolutely try to do it, but good freaking luck. Especially in the wake of a 1-6 season, where, as if things couldn't get any worse for the fans, a few days before this game, on Halloween, you traded away your star running back and future Hall of Famer and backbone of the team, Eric Dickerson, to the Indianapolis Colts, leaving many to question if the organization was committed to winning by not paying him what he was worth. Said one fan, "After 25 plus years as always a Rams fan, I've had it with an organization that obviously couldn't care less about winning. Never again a Rams fan." Another fan echoed those thoughts, saying, "As a 30-plus year Rams supporter, I fretted about my decision to give up my season tickets 2 years ago because of high prices. Just heard about the Dickerson trade. I'm fretting no longer." Fan morale and support was at an all-time low. So it was the worst-kept secret in the world that this Rams-Saints game right here was going to be the furthest thing from a sellout, which was confirmed when just over 43,000 people showed up to Anaheim Stadium, making the stadium roughly 65% full. Now obviously, there are some things that are completely unforeseeable, and that you cannot account for at the start of the season. The Rams being a bad football team and being 1-6 after having 4 straight seasons where they made the playoffs, you can't account for that. The Rams trading away Eric Dickerson, thereby delivering a crushing blow to fan morale, you can't account for that. But there are other things that you absolutely can account for and factor in when making your schedule. The possibility of a strike, making it harder for fans to want to come back and support the NFL afterwards, especially in fickle markets? Yeah, you can account for that. The fact that the Rams don't sell out games and every single game is blacked out? Yeah, you can account for that. It's like if, for this upcoming baseball season, there's a rule that says for a game to be shown on Sunday Night Baseball across the entire country, that 20,000 tickets have to be sold. If the Yankees don't do it, yeah, that's shocking. If the A's don't do it, that shouldn't shock anyone with the brain that's been paying attention for more than 5 seconds. And yet, the NFL clearly did not think this one through, because with the Rams game being blacked out in Los Angeles due to the game not being sold out in time, or at any time for that matter, you had a massive conundrum, considering the fact that this was, quite literally, the only game on CBS in the later window. So now, just to set the scene and tie all this information together, you've got 3 games on in the late window for this particular date. 2 of them are on NBC, meaning that only one of them was on CBS, at a time when cross-flexing did not exist and was not permitted. And as for the one game on CBS, that game could not be shown in Los Angeles, as in the second largest media market in the country, because that game was blacked out. In an entirely foreseeable and preventable problem that the NFL, for some reason, did not address or did not realize at the start of the season, there was now a realization that hit the league just days before Week 9 was set to kick off. Oh crap! We completely forgot to schedule a game for television. Days beforehand, the NFL realized the massive problem on their hands that they had that was foreseeable all the way back in the spring when the schedule came out, but they didn't do anything about it for some reason. They realized that Los Angeles, as in the second largest media market in the country, was not going to get a late game entirely because of the NFL's own incompetence when it came to making the schedule. They realized that as it stood, there was nothing for them to show, especially because they couldn't just circumvent the blackout rule and show the Rams game, since the Rams can choose to block it. And the last thing the Rams want to do is show the game on television, because it would incentivize even more fans to stay home and would cut into their revenue even more, at a time when they desperately needed it. And again, I cannot stress this enough. This was entirely foreseeable that this game right here would not sell out. This was not shocking. If this was a Green Bay Packers game, which always sells out, alright, I'll give the NFL a pass. If this was a game where the Rams were hosting a team like the Raiders or the 49ers, alright, I'll give the NFL a pass. But for this game right here, what prior history possibly told you that this game was going to sell out? What prior history had you possibly believe that you'd be able to show a game at 4 o'clock Eastern in Los Angeles on CBS and that this game would be good to go? From the moment the schedule was released, it was blatantly obvious that this was going to be blacked out locally. Anyone with a brain knew that. The only possible way this wasn't going to get blacked out is if the Rams were undefeated, there was no strike, and the Saints had just traded for Joe Montana. And even then, I'm not sure. In a normal world, this game was always getting blacked out, which meant that the NFL had to pivot, and pivot fast. They needed to move one of their 1 o'clock games on CBS to the 4 o'clock window, because obviously, if they didn't do that, CBS would have been ticked off and might have taken them to court. You think CBS, after already losing ratings for a month due to 3 replacement games and 1 week where they just outright canceled the games, was going to be thrilled and was going to allow for this incompetence by the league to happen, where they were going to not have a game shown all day in the second largest media market in the country on their network? No chance. No chance at all. The NFL needed to pick a game that was good enough to appeal to the CBS executives and Los Angeles, but not so good as to hurt their ratings in the early slate, since remember, CBS only had the single header that week, so the vast majority of the country was going to be getting the CBS game in the early window and not the later window. You couldn't do the game between the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers, since that was the network's marquee game that week with Pat Summerall and John Madden on the call. But it seemed as though everything else was fair game. And with that, just days before the game was set to kick off, and I truly mean mere days, the NFL decided to switch this game right here from the early window to the later window so that Los Angeles would get to watch a later game after all. Because moving from 1 o'clock Eastern to 4 o'clock Eastern was the battle I talked about at the top of the video between the Dallas Cowboys and the Detroit Lions. When I say that this was a last-minute decision, I truly mean that it was a last-minute decision. You will not believe how tight this deadline was. Here are the NFL standings on Monday, November 2nd, 1987, as shown in Wisconsin. You can see the games taking place at 3 o'clock Central Time or 4 o'clock Eastern. You see the Rams-Saints game, the Dolphins-Bengals game, and the Oilers-49ers game. You don't see the Cowboys-Lions game, which is still slated for the early window at 1 o'clock Eastern. Here's the NFL standings on Tuesday, November 3rd, 1987, as shown in Brattleboro, Vermont. You can see the games taking place at 4 o'clock Eastern. You see the Rams-Saints game, the Dolphins-Bengals game, and the Oilers-49ers game. You don't see the Cowboys-Lions game, which is still slated for the early window at 1 o'clock Eastern. Here's the NFL standings on Wednesday, November 4th, 1987, as shown in New York via Newsday. You can see the games taking place at 4 o'clock Eastern. You see the Rams-Saints game, the Dolphins-Bengals game, and the Oilers-49ers game. You don't see the Cowboys-Lions game, which is still slated for the early window at 1 o'clock Eastern. Here's the NFL standings on Thursday, November 5th, 1987, as shown in Shreveport, Louisiana. You can see the games taking place at 3 o'clock Central Time or 4 o'clock Eastern. You see the Rams-Saints game, the Dolphins-Bengals game, and the Oilers-49ers game. You don't see the Cowboys-Lions game, which is still slated for the early window at 1 o'clock Eastern. Here's the NFL standings on Friday, November 6, 1987, as shown in South Bend, Indiana. so not even 48 hours before kickoff, you can see the games taking place at 4 o'clock Eastern. You see the Rams-Saints game, the Dolphins-Bengals game, and the Oilers-49ers game. You don't see the Cowboys-Lions game, which is still slated for the early window at 1 o'clock Eastern. And here's the NFL standings on Saturday, November 7th, 1987, as shown in Maine. So 24 hours before kickoff. Remember, this was taking place on November 8th. These are the standings and schedule as it is on November 7th. You can see the games taking place at 4 o'clock Eastern. You see the Rams-Saints game, the Dolphins-Bengals game, and the Oilers-49ers game. You don't see the Cowboys-Lions game, which is still slated for the early window at 1 o'clock Eastern. I am not kidding when I say that this was a last-minute switch that for some reason no one prepared for. Finally, the announcement was made that the game was getting moved to the later window, where everyone started reporting on it. I love that this is just a little 2-sentence blurb, with the first sentence explaining what's happening, and the second sentence explaining why it's happening, with the only explanation being that it was changed at the request of CBS. For those who were not in the loop, you might not think anything of this. For those who didn't know how television rules worked back then, you might think, that's odd that CBS wants to move a 1-6 team to the 4 o'clock window, but I guess it makes some sense. It lets more people see the Bears-Packers rivalry and listen to Madden and Summerall. And in the markets to only get one game, Cowboys-Lions probably appeals to more people right now than Rams-Saints. But if you knew, you were laughing your butt off at this. You were losing your mind at the fact that only now, just moments before the game was set to kick off, did the NFL realize that they didn't have the game to show in the second largest media market in the country due to something entirely foreseeable. The game was changed at the request of CBS? They asked nicely? More like the demand of CBS. More like litigation's gonna happen if you don't move the game. Now, when it came to this absolutely insane scheduling controversy between the 4 teams behind me right here, the New Orleans Saints, the Los Angeles Rams, the Detroit Lions, and the Dallas Cowboys, you would think that the NFL would learn their lesson and would avoid something like this the following year. However, you'd be mistaken, because during 1 week in the 1988 season, the NFL made a very similar mistake, although this time it was with NBC. That year, there were 3 league games, and all 3 of them featured an NFC team as the road team, meaning that all 3 games were televised by CBS. So the NFL didn't realize this, and they had to move the game between the Miami Dolphins and the San Diego Chargers to 4 o'clock Eastern Time at the very last minute, just so that NBC had a later game. I talked about that controversy in a previous video of mine, so if you want to learn more about that, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner or the link in the description. Now, as for the game that wasn't shown in Los Angeles, as in this game right here between the Los Angeles Rams and the New Orleans Saints, the game went as expected, as the Saints continued their great season and the Rams continued their atrocious season, with the Saints winning the game convincingly by a final score of 31-14. At no point in the contest did the Rams ever have the lead, and even though the Rams, despite trailing by 17 at one point in the first half, cut it to a 3-point game early in the third quarter, the Saints pulled away late, scoring the final 14 points in the contest and never looking back. The Rams turned it over 3 times and had no answers for New Orleans' fantastic 1-2 punch at running back of Dalton Hilliard and Reuben Mays, as the Saints picked up 232 rushing yards on 5.3 yards per carry, completely dominating the time of possession in the process by holding onto the ball for 37 of the game's 60 minutes. It was a convincing win that sent the Saints to 5-3, one step closer to their first winning record and playoff appearance in franchise history. And it was a bad loss that sent the Rams to 1-7, all but out of the playoff picture, as they were 4 back of the wild card with 7 to play, and would have to win out just to have a winning record and go 8-7 at the absolute best. And if you were a neutral fan in Los Angeles, you didn't have to watch that game, because you gotta watch this game right here, which I talked about at the top of the video, where the Lions got their second win of the season by defeating the Cowboys 27-17 in a game that would completely set the tone for the disastrous end of the Tom Landry era over the next 14 months. But honestly, if you were a football fan in Los Angeles who wasn't in Anaheim Stadium and just wanted to watch 6 straight hours of football, or I guess 9 straight because Sunday Night Football on ESPN was later that night, in what was the first ever Sunday Night Football game for ESPN and that package, just be glad that you got to watch any game at all, because we were dangerously close to having that not happen. The NFL badly dropped the ball with this schedule screw-up, but better late than never to fix the issue, I suppose. November 8th, 1987 was a bad day for football fans in Los Angeles. The Raiders lost, the Rams lost, and they almost didn't get to see a second game like the rest of the country did due to the NFL's own incompetence and lack of foresight. Because when it came to Los Angeles, the situation that took place on this day in 1987 with the NFL and CBS was a load of BS. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.